tonight? Is there a revolution in the arts? Town meeting tonight.
Welcome to Historic Town Hall in New York City for another spontaneous and unrehearsed session of America's Town Meeting of the Air. The topic tonight is one that many of you have requested. Is there a revolution in the arts? To conduct our discussion, we have as our guest moderator this evening Dr. Arthur E. Bester, President of Chautauqua Institution and Chairman of the Board of Trustees of Town Hall. Dr. Bester.
Good evening, neighbors. Tonight we ask for your written suggestions as to how we can most effectively contribute to the development of American democracy through Town Hall's 50th anniversary program. Further information on this request will be given at the close of this broadcast. The question tonight, is there a revolution in the arts, is one to which you can have your own answer and even concede to your congressman the right to have his. Since men first began to express themselves artistically, change and innovation have characterized their work. Some critics would insist that the arts are like an automobile engine, which must have at least 1,100 revolutions per minute in order to move at all. This may be true, but in the last 50 years, perhaps something has been happening in the arts. Musicians compose sound patterns that we have never heard before. Painters put things on canvas that we've never seen before, and perhaps wouldn't want to see. And as for the writers, well, a rose is a rose is a rose, as Gertrude Stein has said. Does this all put together make a revolution? Three of the speakers who will answer this question are men who have in their lifetimes seen these new artistic movements assert themselves. Each will evaluate what has happened in his own field. In literature, Dr. William Lyon Phelps; in painting, Mr. Albert Sterner; and in music, Mr. Walter Damrosch. Paired with these men are three others who may proclaim the revolution, but actually they don't look very much like long-haired revolutionaries. Mr. Clifton Fadiman for literature, Mr. Stuart Davis for painting, and Mr. Aaron Copland for music. Many of you know our first speaker as the witty and urbane conductor of information pleas, Mr. Clifton Fadiman. Mr. Fadiman is equally famous as the literary critic of the New Yorker magazine. Tonight, for a change, instead of asking the questions, he will attempt to give the answer. Mr. Fadiman.
Ladies and gentlemen, I doubt whether the word revolution means anything very definite when you're talking about literature. What happens is this: a group of writers, or sometimes just one writer, will get impatient with old ways of writing and start out in a different direction. But the old ways are apt to continue peacefully side by side with the new ones for a long, long time. Well, I have only 5 minutes this evening, so suppose I limit myself to the novel only. Why the novel? Because it's the typical literary form of our time, just as the drama was in Shakespeare's time. Changes in the novel, sooner or later, reflect themselves in other forms, such as poetry and plays. And plays, by the way, are generally about 30 years behind the times intellectually. If you don't believe it, attend a few Broadway performances and then compare them with the latest serious novels. To get back to our topic, I should say that since the war, I mean World War I, there's been a shift both in the form and content of the novel. An Englishman and an Irishman are mainly responsible for this. They did not cooperate on it. The Englishman is D.H. Lawrence, whose book Sons and Lovers appeared in 1912. And the Irishman is James Joyce, whose novel Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man was published in 1914. These books struck a new note of rebellion, and that note's been sounding ever since. Lawrence broke through English moral conventions with a loud crash. He dared to talk about human relationships which had been covered up by other novelists. And the same thing's true of James Joyce. Joyce also invented new techniques or tricks of storytelling. And you'll find some of these tricks in his great book, Ulysses. After Joyce and Lawrence came an army of other writers who extended the range of the novel. They dared to explore the hidden places of the soul. They worked out all kinds of strange methods for reporting their discoveries. Now today, we notice the novel broadening out again in a different direction, or you might say it returns to a field once worked by Charles Dickens, that is, the field of social criticism. We find books like The Grapes of Wrath, written out of a burning indignation with what John Steinbeck, the author, feels are certain injustices, just as Uncle Tom's Cabin was written out of a similar indignation. During the past 10 years, a great many American novels have been novels of social criticism, and most of them, I should like to add, have, by artistic standards, been pretty punk. The mere fact, however, that so many writers deal not so much with individual lives as with the fate of whole classes of people marks a real shift in emphasis. On the other hand, while a great many writers follow the lead of novelists like John Steinbeck, and Ernest Hemingway, and William Faulkner, and other experimenters, there are just as many, probably more, who write in the safe, established, comfortable patterns. The two great bestsellers of the past few years, for example, have been Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind and John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. Both attracted large audiences, Miss Mitchell's much larger than Mr. Steinbeck's. Miss Mitchell's book could have been written 30 or 40 years ago, as far as I can see, while Mr. Steinbeck's book is definitely contemporary. The authors are writing at the same time, from the point of view of the calendar, but only from the point of view of the calendar. Now, when people criticize many new novels, what they're objecting to, I guess, is the frankness and candor of the language used in some of them. In this one respect, certainly, there's been something like a revolution. Though even here we must be cautious, because great classics like Shakespeare, Rabelais, and even the Old Testament make use of very frank language when necessary. Mr. Steinbeck, for example, has been criticized on this score, and so have other writers of his generation, like Erskine Caldwell and James T. Farrell. These men, however, aren't sensation seekers. They're trying to present characters truly. Now, many of these characters aren't the sort of people you'd like to receive in your own home. But then the world isn't made up only of people that you'd like to receive in your own home. I honestly don't believe that novelists like Farrell, Steinbeck, or Caldwell are out to shock you. The fact that they use candid language doesn't make their books better or worse. Some of their books seem to me good, some bad. But they're bad or good, irrespective of whether they contain a few phrases not usually heard in polite society. On the whole, I think the tendency toward realism, a tendency so marked as to amount to a definitely new trend, is a healthy one, but can be overdone. The author may become so interested in the uglier aspects of American life that he'll stop being interested in that life as a whole. But the opposite tendency is just as bad. Those novelists who recreate the American past or present in terms of sentimentality only aren't doing much, except helping us to escape from the day's headlines. There's such a thing, I guess, as being able to stand just so much reality and no more. When we're fed up with reality, we read exciting books like Gone with the Wind, and for a time we escape into a less depressing world than our own. This is perfectly okay if we don't take this imaginary world too seriously. All of which doesn't seem to offer any flat yes or no to our question. My feeling is that the era of rebellion started at about the end of the war and is now petering out. Perhaps we're in for a short period of traditional writing, and then the pendulum swings again. Literature isn't static. Try to freeze it, as the totalitarian countries are trying to do, and it ceases to be literature. With good books, as with good men, it's a question of liberty or death.
Thank you, Mr. Fadiman. The former students of our next speaker can testify he's handy with both the questions and the answers. Dr. William Lyon Phelps, Professor Emeritus of Yale University and Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Phelps is an old friend of ours who's spoken for many years to our regular lecture audiences here in Town Hall, and as you know, has appeared frequently on this program. Dr. Phelps.
when we talk of revolutions, remember there have been many kinds of political revolutions, some very wet and some very dry. Two of the wettest political revolutions happened respectively in 1789 in France and in 1917 in Russia. The streets ran with blood. That's what I call a wet revolution. The driest revolution in human history, politically, happened in 1688. Not one drop of blood was shed. But the revolution was thorough, disgusting, because at this moment, being under the parliamentary government established in 1688 when they threw over the royal prerogative. The revolutions have closed, especially in that 19 women all too. Is the rarest stadium. Only a creature that is of original. That first Remember, yes, said the boy, my conscience.
This all you know. Stronghold of the ism, where the many trends have so bewildered most of us, we ask one that leave off with one of what follows. Sermon.
I wouldn't want to try to argue, but I don't see how it could be done. The only point of debate can be what kind of a revolution is going on and the question of whether it is good or bad. I am sure that there is a revolution in the art of painting. I think it is good, and I will attempt to explain why I think so. Now, most people see art as one of the necessary forms of expression, but they do not all function socially. The person who said that art holds a mirror up to nature provided a monkey wrench which has long been used by provincialism to tangle the wheels of progress. Art does not hold a mirror up to nature and does not reflect the social struggle. It is simply a copy. Art is conditioned by both, but it conditions both. Social change can spring from a work of art from social change. It predicts as well as records. The revolution in art is an integral part of the revolution in society, not just a death mask of it. Painting has gone through a whole series of revolutions even in the last 40 years. This has taken place chiefly in France and is being carried on in America. The current exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art contrasts excellent examples of this period with works by Italian masters of the Renaissance. A great difference is clear, and a great identity is clear in the works of the two periods. We prefer the modern works because they are closer to our daily experience. They were painted by men who lived, and who still live, in the revolutionary lights, speeds, and spaces of today, which science and art have made possible. An artist who has traveled on a steam train, driven an automobile, or flown in an airplane doesn't feel the same way about form and space as one who has not. An artist who has used telegraph, telephone, and radio doesn't feel the same way about time and space as one who has not. And an artist who lives in the world of the motion picture, electricity, and synthetic chemistry doesn't feel the same way about light and color as one who has not. An artist who has lived in a democratic society has a different view of what a human being really is than one who has not. These new experiences, emotions, and ideas are reflected in modern art, but not as a copy of them. They are coordinated by the artist and established as a real order in the materials of art. Art changes the person who sees it, and these changes are reflected in other fields of social action. The Renaissance artist and the modern artist are alike in that they both organize their experience in a real and coherent order in the materials of art. But this order is always unique, acted upon, and in turn reacting upon the society of its time. The real order of art is not an ideal order or system of beauty, because an ideal order would be timeless, and art exists in time. The cultural heritage of the American artist today has its roots and is fed by the cultures of all times and races. Therefore, in view of this fact, some large and expensive best-selling books on art for the last few years are a menace to American art, because these books preach a provincial brand of American totalitarianism in art, which, if carried out, would be the equivalent of fascism in American art. They would deprive American artists of their cultural heritage. But the great majority of American artists are not seduced by this totalitarian, hillbilly aesthetics with its vicious political and racial implications, because they have formed organizations like the Artists' Congress, an American group, and the United American Artists, which are progressive and have a completely democratic orientation. The existence of these organizations is in itself proof that there is a revolution in art, because none have